I always get asked this. You know,
Yeah.
when I change something in a rider's position, one of the first things they want to know is, am I going to get more power from this? So I've tried to narrow this down to 4, because there's four decent ones, and then there's like an infinite number of tiny ones which won't affect your power output as much, but will have some effect. But the 4 big ones. The first one is kind of an overarching concept, which is pretty straightforward, and that is pain. If you're in pain, the way that your central nervous system works, let's say you're in pain because your seat's too high and your knee's overextending and you're dropping your hip, and there's a whole bunch of then like flow-on effects, which is making your knee hurt. The way your central nervous system works is there are a bunch of protection mechanisms hardwired into your cortical structure at a really, really sort of base evolutionary level. Those are all, so the ones we're talking about are ones which are designed or have evolved to basically protect your body in the event of an overuse injury occurring. So we're not talking about spraining your ankle here, we're talking about something that's building up from a problem with your position in this case. When there's an overuse injury building up, your central nervous system, when you're doing damage to your body or you're about to do damage to your body, your central nervous system will curtail your effort. What it will do is it'll do a whole bunch of things. It'll reduce energy delivery to your legs. It'll make you feel more fatigued. You could also potentially have thoughts of quitting when you're riding because your knee is hurting. You'd be thinking, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't keep doing this fast bunch ride because it's hurting my knee. These things will all curtail your training, and they will curtail your power output. So whenever you're in pain, the central nervous system's job is to protect the body in large part and to keep it healthy. So whenever you're damaging yourself, you're going to get a reduction in power output to the pedals. So this is kind of the big overarching concept of the thing which causes the most power loss is pain. It is a massive power suck, and the worse the pain is, the worse it sucks your power. So if you've got a person with really bad back spasms, 30 minutes into a long climb, they're just going to drop their effort level way back. They're never going to reach their pinnacle of load and power output because they're subconsciously trying to protect their body. So pain is the big one. Now, underneath that is all the positional stuff which comes from, which causes you pain. And these are the 3 kind of overarching concepts underneath the pain one. Now, the first one is one that you're probably not expecting, which is the Q factor.
Wow.
Q factor has, and it doesn't necessarily have to cause pain to suck a lot of power.
For those that don't know what Q factor is, firstly.
Q factor is how far apart your feet are.
Yep.
Or how close together they are. Stance width,
Yep.
You can name it a couple of different things. So Q factor is a big power suck if it's really grossly wrong. Now, almost always the problem will be that your Q factor is too narrow. Let's say you're a big, broad-waisted guy with hip impingement, looking at someone behind the camera here, and your knees flare out a little bit from the top tube, or your pelvis is sufficiently wide that your knees cannot descend more or less vertically over the pedal centers without compensation occurring. The first thing that happens when your feet are too close together is you get really poor glute engagement. You also tend to rock on the seat more, which takes a lot of metabolic energy to stabilize through your core and your spinal musculature and that sort of stuff. You tend to get problematic quadricep loading. So the quads being one of the major muscles that's driving down on the pedals. If your knees are flaring out across the line of the pedal like this, you will get overload of either your lateral quad or your medial quad, depending upon how your body compensates, but you won't get even load across your 3 big quadricep muscles and the one that's a bit smaller. So you will get poor distribution of load, and some of the muscles are doing way too much work and some of them are doing very little, and your glutes are inevitably doing almost nothing, which is a big problem. So I'll tell you a very quick story about this. I once, years and years and years ago, I had a guy who was racing in the National Road Series. He was around 80 kilos and he had a threshold power he had a 20-minute power of nearly 400 watts. This guy had suffered from bilateral knee pain forever and he could never get rid of it. He tried everything. He'd had all these different bike fits. He came in and saw me out of desperation. And essentially the problem was his Q factor. I moved his feet, from memory, this was a long time ago, I think I moved his feet apart by around about 10 millimeters on each side. So not a big move, 1 centimeter or so. We used a different pedal system to do this. I got an email from that guy 6 weeks later where he'd done another 20-minute power test and it was 440 watts.
Wow.
This guy picked up 10% on his 20-minute power from a Q factor change. And I basically didn't have to do much else to his position. Because the Q factor being too narrow was causing him knee pain, it was causing him terrible glute engagement, terrible hamstring and posterior chain engagement. He was stabilizing his core excessively using his core musculature, and it was basically sucking power out of his longer duration efforts. So, the Q factor can be a really big one. And that was a very highly trained athlete. This was not a guy whose 20-minute power has varied by 10% season on season.
Yep.
A highly trained athlete, you'd be lucky if you got a 2% increase in your 20-minute power across the course of the season. So Q factor is a big one. The third one, which everyone will know, is the seat height. When it's too high, you get big problems. And when it's too low, it has to be very far too low before you'll get a lot of power suck. But if it's moderately too high or really too high, you'll get enormous problems. And again, this will often cause pain. But in terms of efficiency, pedal stroke efficiency, we talked about the Q factor affecting the relative engagement of your muscle groups. This one will create excessive stretch on the hamstring complex if the seat is too high, and it will create an excessively shortened position in the quadricep group. So muscles, a little bit of physiology for you. Muscles are made up of overlapping protein chains, actin and myosin. You can look these up, and basically these overlapping chains of muscle, they have they have these little electrochemical bonds between them, which basically act like waves. Like they go like this, and they shorten or lengthen depending upon what the nervous system tells them to do. Muscles have a fairly narrowish repetitive efficiency range, a repetitive movement efficiency range. So when the fibers are overlapped too much, you get really inefficient muscle contraction, and when they're overlapped not enough, you get very poor muscle contraction, contractile effort as well. The sweet spot seems to be somewhere in the middle, when they're just moving through that middle of their range with the most overlapping fibers without it being too shortened, in too much of a shortened position. So we call this the length tension relationship of the muscle. And if it's on too much tension, or it's too lengthened, or it's too shortened with too much overlap, you get inefficiency. You get excessive metabolite production and poor strength and poor coordination and all this sort of stuff. It causes neurological fatigue. It basically sucks your power. So if your seat's too high, the quads will be too short, and the hamstrings will be too long, and if it's too low, you get the opposite situation. So there's a sweet spot in there where when the seat is in the correct range, it's not going to suck power. Yeah. But seat height in particular, if it's too high, can be a big power suck.
Yeah, and the ironic situation is that most people that come to you seem to be running it too high, if anything, when in actual fact, if they're going to get it wrong, it should probably be too low.
Absolutely. Yeah. I'd rather you be 3 or 4 or 5 millimeters too low than 5 millimeters too high. Yeah. That is happening less and less. The proliferation of good seat height information, perhaps we can put a link to my previous video on seat height back here. Yeah. I'm getting less and less people coming in with horrific seat heights. Because most of them have researched this before they've come in to see me. They've set their own seat height using this method, and it's worked pretty well.
Nice.
So it is getting better as we go. So we're getting the information out there. The last one, asymmetry. The more asymmetrical you are, the worse the effect is. Now this can have, again, myriads of different causes, but if you're really wonky, if you're dropping your hip real bad, you're going to get excessive quadricep loading on one side and excessive hamstring loading on the other. You're going to get one glute that's doing too much and one that's doing nothing. Asymmetry is a big power suck. It also creates a situation where it requires a lot of compensatory effort, neurological compensatory effort from your central nervous system with its motor patterning to deal with the asymmetry and do the best it can given the asymmetrical position that you're forcing your body to operate in. So the more asymmetrical you are, the more it's going to suck your power. I've had a lot of people over the years, like lots, where they have come in to resolve a symmetry issue. We fixed the symmetry issue and they've picked up significant power on their 20-minute efforts and that sort of stuff. So that is a big deal if you're highly asymmetrical. Now I should put caveats in here right at the end. You will see most of the gains from fixing these things on your longer efforts. The longer the effort is, the more your position matters in terms of power generation. The shorter it is, the less it matters. If you're doing an all-out 1-minute seated effort, and your seat's a bit high, it's not going to be the major limiter. If you're doing a 3-minute, even a 3 to 5 minute VO2 style effort, the positional problems will not be a major limiter. But if you're doing a 20 or a 30-minute effort, the positional problems will be more of a limiting factor because your efficiency matters more the longer the effort is. The shorter efforts tend to be limited by different aspects of your physiology than what we've just spoken about before, but the longer the effort is, the more power suck you're going to get if one of these four things is wrong. So something to consider. And yeah, if you're after more information about all this stuff and you want to get help set up your own position, here's a link to our online fitting course that we're doing, mate.
Yeah, we'll actually be below.
Below, not above.
Yeah, yeah.
Below, not
Bike
above.
Fit Fundamentals.
Bike Fit Fundamentals. It will help anyone trying to self-fit themselves.
All right. Cheers. Thanks.
No worries.